Hello everyone, today we talk about the Barbarian Invasions. In an introductory video, I know that I've already spoken about this multiple times, and some of you may are, even bored. I'm actually finishing the, manualistic part for most of these topics, so actually probably will not talk about them. I mean, not specifically about them, but let's say in these general terms anymore. We will pass at some point to something more detailed, more in-depth. But also there are lots of new subscribers, so this hopefully is interesting for them or simply for anybody that wants just to listen to it, to have a refreshment. And always given that we talk about this stuff in different terms. Right, and more specifically, with the aim of picturing this broader scenario, which at some point we'll have in fact to look at more in detail. And this basic parameters are very important. That's what you learned at the beginning of every path in this kind of historical journey. And these are things that I presume at this point you've gone to school. You should already know, in a way, or heard of them in a general fashion. Then naturally by academic standards they're mandatory, but we sometimes forget that when especially scholars go ahead, they tend to take some turns that are not necessarily just because of a hyper specialization in a field, but still as a consequence is that they tend to look at these broader historiographical problems in, can say, relativistic, but sometimes in extremistic terms. The Barbarian Invasions, right? There is also a terminology in here that should be explained. Today we'll try to keep it simple, actually. But this topic, not aware of now, it's still, on the fore. But up to like 10 years ago, it was like one of the most central and debated topics. On the wake of a revival, let's say, of late antiquity in the previous 20, even 30 years, and this broader reconsideration of what or even more actually, back in time, depending on how certain environments have received them, how the different academies responded to that. I presume that these are, aside from the most obvious and more serious research, or beautiful books that have come out relatively recently, beautiful, especially in let's say, disclosure terms, not because even the experts sometimes are clearly framing the specific topic, maybe yes, but in turn framing it in broader terms are specifically proper. Recently I was reading some work by Heather that wrote beautiful things, especially about the migration era and so on, but sometimes, aside from certain details that from a military perspective especially are blatantly wrong, and just also by the most updated historiographical acquisitions, in spite of what I can personally think, but sometimes it's the narrative that every person has a different narrative, but there's a certain finesse we could say, right? It's not about having this radically ideologized ideas for which you have to interpret, especially from a moralistic point of view, this history. But it's essentially that makes you always aware of saying, is there a more sophisticated, more realistic, a more spot-on way of addressing a certain topic, right? And it's not easy for these big ones, right? But I presume that also coming from a military historical point of view makes you usually a bit more rationalistic or anti-dogmatic, so that that this is a Schwerpunkt's leitmotif about trying, at least making the effort of being objective, which can never be fully achieved, but it's still very different from arriving on migration era videos that start from the standpoint that either, I don't know, the Romans or the Germans were the bad or the good guys, or that have to read all this kind of moralistic, apocalyptic terms. There is still a lot, especially, and that's the reason why I make these videos, to have acquired in the masses and worldwide in terms of just the dialectic in which you should put certain topics in the right perspective, or at least the ones that are more useful for this time in history to address these topics. And I say this because objectively the history of the migration era, the barbarian invasions, I usually say migration era because aside from the outcomes, these were objectively movements of peoples that indeed caused invasions, right? We'll address this briefly, but that were triggered essentially by a response to this stuff, for example, that we didn't have to call the barbarians. It's something that came up in the 70s because people began to say, but barbarian is offensive. Today we came back actually to the concept of barbarian simply because it the alternative that those studies were also kind of a politically oriented sometimes, were stressing, for example, just the Germanicity, let's say, of these populations which weren't all Germanic, especially were all mixed by a certain degree. Of course, especially for what the West was concerned, the German element is the most important. But barbarian, let's say, is more broadly fitting to this pretty composite setting of peoples that went on the march, and that about whom we don't even specifically know what they were, and simply because there is no way to know it, right? It's not that we have genetic finds in a statistical quantity that allow us to say, okay, well, that we have a pretty clear idea of even where these guys came from, which is just already something very, it's even wrong to pose in ethnographical terms in a way, or even ethnogenetically speaking, at certain levels, but specifically even how many were they and how much were they mixed, right? I had a brief experience, as you know, with my bachelor about the very late migration here, at least for what Western Europe was concerned. And there are certain problems that, certain ideas about, for example, how mixed certain peoples were, that it's not much because I care about the ethnic side of the story, mostly because, I care, for example, from the military side, right? How did they vote? What were the quotas of infantry, cavalry, things like these? That I realized that even, allegedly renowned, properly renowned scholars who wrote about these things had simply made cheap relativism about the fact that you could say, okay, yeah, they were all mixed because it was fashionable at the time to stress just the fact they were mixed to curb the, the conservative perspective that tends to say also in another extreme sense that this is not true. But just for doing that and not for really looking at the evidence and saying, can we first of all know anything about that, right? And these dialectics, these even phraseology, way of addressing this is somewhat being abused in many ways. And starting, in fact, from the title, right? I decided to title this video as the Barbarian Invasions, exactly because it's a term that's been a bit stigmatized, but taken out of the discourse, because we prefer to stress that these were migrations, not invasions, right? And it's most obviously dictated worldwide by a political reason. That is to say, that was a revival in the interest in the period, because also the modern migrations and the political questions that they arise, so that it sounded mostly more liberal dominated universities. If you stress barbarian invasions, you were feeding the conservative side, saying that migrants are invading our countries and things, but which has literally nothing to do with what was happening at the time in perspective, because why would you compare even the two things, right? They're very different dynamics, and they especially aside from a very a much more dramatic and traumatic dynamic from which in proportion they stem from today. That is not to say that catastrophes do not happen, or that there are not good reasons for some people to go searching for a better life elsewhere. I'm just saying that speaking of the migration era, comparing the world of the 2000s it's not very wise to say the least, and we must give that. It doesn't matter. Of course, these people were migrating. Of course they were. And of course they wanted to get fresh pastures, or even just open to Romanization, as most, especially the Germans, and the most other, Roman influenced peoples. Because also in here between Romanization and Roman influence, there is an important difference after all. But it's obvious that they were entering as peoples, so everything with children, women, old people, but also, men at arms, which all the able freemen were fundamentally about, and these were actual invasions, right? And of course they were mediated in different ways, but it has nothing to do with the fact that of course these were armed peoples were pressing at the boundaries of the empire for entering and fundamentally seizing what they simply needed to, right? So it's fine to both stress that these were invasions as much as they were migrations, right? Because it's what they were at the same time. There's no doubt about it. And also using the term barbarian, which is actually fine. Given that you know what it means historically and historiographically speaking, and given that we don't use it in the term that it was used back in the day by some, by the way, because the Roman Empire was very culturally diverse, and even the term barbar is actually, there are different etymologies. Recently also read another one that is even more complex, but it's not just about the Hellenic xenophobic thing from which the picture has originated. And surely we in classical times, at which the Romans, for example, dealt with it, used in a very in a different way, at least especially at the beginning, but also during the migration era proper, late antiquity. And we'll see about this because also the two halves responded differently to the thing. But also, there is no way a person in the 2000s is able to use the term barbarian the same way these people back in the day used them. Right? It's a completely different mindset. Even if you want to insult someone, even if you want to insult the same peoples, calling them barbarians, still just be aware that you are doing it with an exception. Barbarian is being filtered by, in fact, the late antiquity, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the contemporary era, and it's a very different thing from what you even think the word means, right? And starting from the history of words is very important. The same term invasion, right? What does it mean according to you? Let's face the fact that there are etymologies, and people should know the meaning of words they use. Invasion comes from the Latin invadere, right? And from invado, which means literally to go in, right? That's what it means, right? And then of course, semantically speaking, words take different characters, but if we are historical about the concept of invasion, there are lots of words now that have a perfectly neutral meaning that are being loaded mostly with negative meaning, and we're kind of banishing them. Some of these are beautiful, in fact, Latin or Hellenic derived words that were pretty neutral in many ways, also because this word was fairly neutral. I mean, Rome had built its own empire invading other peoples, and not just invading them, but properly enslaving them or exterminating them, but also integrating them, which tells you how neutral the concept really was. The Romans, by the way, were the only ones who did this at the time, and that's the reason why they had an empire, right? That lasted and had this overwhelming impact, not just in Western civilization, but in world civilization, quite easily. Secondly, don't if you ever meet someone who says that these were just invasions, right? You find usually it's always right and left, right? The right would say, "Oh no, these were invasions. It's like today's those dirty migrants," right? And then you find the other side, the leftists say, "Oh, you can't say invasion because these are just migrations. You are racist. You don't want to know." No, they were both the same thing. And if you ever meet this kind of people, just know that they have actually a very low, if actually non-existent historical understanding of the problem, generally speaking. And or they are ideologized at the point they are even faking it, so it's even worse, right? But of course we can dispense with these people, because actually who does care about ignorant and stupid people? We should actually do without them. Unfortunately we all are, right, by a good margin, so we don't have to be hypocrites or purists either, otherwise we become Puritans like them. Fake Puritans, by the way. So speaking of this, today we will address naturally some of the most important dynamics of the migration era, and or specifically, also the Roman side of the story, not just the invasions per se. So these are all things we have discussed widely and we know, but just, let's frame them a little bit. So we have, first of all, pictured this fact that, of course, these movements of peoples included entire populations. We're talking from, something like a range of the tens to the hundreds of thousands, right, for the single greater confederations, so that they weren't even this huge numbers after all. I mean, the Roman areas were much more populated, and after all, these settlers eventually diluted into local populations, right? There is not an area of the empire, except perhaps for Britain, where the German language took over, like as a sort of certain areas of the frontiers, the boundaries, and this naturally happened, in fact, in the least populated areas, right? In those that had gone depopulated from the massive problems that had occurred in the Roman Empire since centuries, that we shouldn't also read in such a dramatic term. That is to say, we have somewhat overly emphasized the contrast between the peak of classical civilization, as if this were the thresholds of modernity, and these things happened that were so disastrous. No, this was, the ancient world had a much lower potential, just in terms of properly of resources, of technologies, and know-how, of this distribution of wealth, than we often think. So actually, it's more normal than it seems to start seeing, because of wars that also were normal, given the normal instability of political and social systems of the time, right? What we should care about is not much why the Roman Empire, first of all, didn't fall up to the 15th century, but given this big contraction, the loss of most Western provinces and so on, but chiefly how the hell they made it to last so long and to have such a deep impact, right, all over. That's the big question that doesn't seem we are addressing much anymore. We mostly talk about the late antiquity and migration era in Schwerpunkt, because it's mostly a medieval history-based channel for now. But I don't think there are many re-editions of the thing. Objectively late of the versions of how Rome expanded, etc. But it's often not recognized a bit for the same reason why the most left-leaning perspective here has prevailed in the narrative. Because, of course, and it's fair to do it, we stress the unspeakable brutality of the expansion of Rome, that actually was the same level of brutality used everywhere. It's just that it was on a much larger scale, because the Romans had those means to do it, right? But these other peoples who were invaded, enslaved, and exterminated were absolutely no better by any moral standard than the Romans, right? That's another thing that some people want to stress, because because also mostly of ethno-nationalistic reasons, as if this Central European peoples were conquered were these pure examples of honesty and alleged civilization, right? And unfortunately, that's also very widespread, mostly, as you understand, right-wing thing, which is even in their exemplificative of basically having no dimensional understanding of what ancient history basically was, right? Just by sheer, sometimes I met people who say, why do we have to talk so much about the Romans? for the ancient world. There were lots of other peoples out there. Well, because like the overwhelming amount of stuff is either Greek or Roman, and the overwhelming amount of all we know about the other peoples is from the Greeks and the Romans. So I think that's a pretty elementary question to answer, why we study so much the Romans, if it wasn't just for the sheer legacy of Roman civilization that is the most impacting in the history of the West, at least. And that's something that, that's such a naive question that, of course, people who pose it come from certain educational, sometimes even from certain national, but I don't want to discriminate in this regard, backgrounds, make you realize that they're not acquainted with a concrete historical education, right? They're not exposed properly to the sources, to the literature. They don't have that dimension. So even if you find this kind of narratives, just throw them away because they're completely useless. Another thing here is that there were certain areas of the empire, demographically speaking, the former West eventually as they came to decline, which is also a very tricky ground, because what is the West? When does it end? Like the Western half, right? 476 is definitely not the end of just even of the Western half, right? There was a formality in there, but Syagrius would have thought otherwise. Nepos would have thought otherwise. The empire ends either in the western half, which was just an administrative part of the empire never ends. Never. It ends either in 486 or in 493, right? That's the true end of the western half of the Roman Empire. But in this process, demographically speaking, it's obvious that the regions that were mostly less populated, and as a consequence less Romanized, because the Roman system had properly taken root in the most productive, most advanced areas, right, were the ones that got more easily barbarized, right, in West mostly Germanized, as you understand, and where the impact was more important, right. But we'll see it later, the fact of settling these foreign peoples wasn't at all a novelty, or even a problem for that matter. On the contrary, the Romans were increasing this practice because they needed the labor force as much as the fighting force. As you know, there's an important divide after 378, as we will see, but this was absolutely normal in principle, right, in the concept of settling and Romanizing other peoples that wanted and needed to come into the empire. This is another point of the story. It's not that these peoples were completely, no, I don't want Rome, I don't like it. They perfectly understood when they were civilized enough, they were exposed to, there were certain preconditions, let's say, for the exposure to the empire to be assimilated, right? A good part of for example, the Western Celtic world was well assimilated. Think about Gaul, even southern Britain. At the end of the day, that was very well connected. They shared, those were areas that shared something in common. Germany was more problematic. Even just the Danubian area was all Celtic in nature. Never, aside from Moesia, in the south of Dacia, was not intensely Romanized. That's where Wallachia would emerge from, by the way, and that's called exactly like that because the other peoples, mostly Germanic, that arrived there, they found this intensely Romanized area where they spoke Romance, right, eventually, even up to this point, and it would even have this dramatic impact for the development of the modern nation of Romania and its Roman Neo-Latin identity in a way. So naturally, also, why these movements? This is also another enormous question. We're not talking about the causes in here, the domino effect of, that these guys being pushed by other peoples, which is not entirely all, right? Because, for example, the German tribes already by the end of the second century, the second half of the second century, began to move, and you can't simply say it's something that was happening in Central Asia that brought to that, right? There were important changes that we can't unfortunately read well, but it's obvious that all these the Mediterranean areas were the most fertile, most populated. The ones were all simply the higher standards of life and wealth was concentrated. So it's obvious that these people, the most fertile lands, right, where these people would like to settle. From the colder areas, right? We're talking about the Iron Age. I mean, it's a time in which climate does, even a few degrees in temperature really make a great difference, right? Just technologically speaking, the possibility of sustaining larger settlements. There are important problems that are the ones through which you can read also the geography of the empire. We even about the thing of the climatic reason. I mean, the alleged coldening of the climate. I mean, it is a possible option. There wouldn't be anything strange about that. It's actually very likely that there were climatic reasons, but at this point, that was also a fashion. Now we have stopped, fortunately, to attribute every single political, social change to climate, especially for these times. Human groups tend to do strange things on their own, right? With whether it's warm, whether it's fresher, they do it, and we know it pretty well. So, of course, once again, the climate factor could be very important, but in fact, also these other more exquisitely political military aspects were probably having even a way more important role. That were all intertwined, and there were populations especially began to press from the Eurasian steppes, as we've seen, semi-nomadic tribes, right, that began to search for new spaces westwards, which is something that actually was happening since a long time, right? Even if you look at the history of, the Scythians and the Sarmatians, that's basically the same story. So only it happened in a moment in which the empire was stable enough, and that didn't cause too much problem. I mean, the Sarmatians kept pressing at the Roman boundaries, but they're not among the group of peoples, and we mostly think they actually brought to this crash of the empire. Consider also that the Roman Empire, this is a perspective that we rarely get, but I mean, was naturally a hell of a power that mostly used a deterrent force to keep at bay all these various populations. It's not that the Romans conquered certain people, so these peoples disappeared. The peoples kept living there. Of course, they changed. In part, they were exterminated. In part, deported. Lots of languages disappeared under Roman domination. But factually, any empire controls peoples, right? It doesn't control land, because if you don't have labor force, that land is useless. If you think about the Roman military, especially before the crisis of the 3rd century, the reforms of the 4th, there were a very few troops. Like, there were 125,000 legionnaires and an equal number of auxiliaries. And considering that this thing stretched from Scotland to the Persian Gulf, well, that's actually pretty damn few. And consider also the communications of the time. So the picture we get mostly is that also the Roman Empire in this, of course, didn't have to meet much of threats for many centuries. I mean, from Augustan times to basically for another 200, 300 years, and actually up to the late 4th century, didn't actually meet this overwhelming, problem of pressure from at the frontier. So it was a pretty stable empire, but we mostly see it from the fragile, teleological, the fact that the empire had to break at some point because of these pressures. But we sometimes overlook the fact that the same Roman Empire had allowed destabilization of many other systems, right? We are also so much concerned about the external influxes on the empire. How many times you have heard about the alleged barbarization of the Roman army, which is a pure idiocy, because there is nothing specifically Roman or barbarian about the Roman army per se, right? Especially in terms of sheer, a Roman is a Roman just politically by citizenship, right? So everybody can join and become a Roman over time, and especially in the army. And aside from that, the Roman army always, there's no comparison between the Romanizing dynamic carried out by the Roman army at all times in Roman history. well beyond the migration era and the barbarian influence within the Roman army itself, right? The Roman army was possibly the best Romanizer of the Roman state. In fact, its most efficient branch, the ones also in which the state invested the most, as you realize. And therefore we say, because of the decadentistic thing in a very Western-centric manner, the Romans became Germanized, or they became Persianized. It's all about the Eastern stuff, it wasn't like the true Rome of one time. This is also nonsense if you realize how different objectively Roman culture could be at the time of, let's say, I don't know, Furius Camillus, or the time of Scipio Africanus, or the time of Caesar, the same time of Hadrian, right? If these guys had all looked at each other, they would remain disgusted. They would have thought they weren't true Romans at all, right? But we think now, those were the true Romans, as if there was a Roman, monolithic culture or whatever, which is valid for any single culture out there. And don't think that we're not sensitive to ancient propaganda in a way. That not specifically about this, but I mean the idea that of certain aspects of discontinuity, its symbology, most parts of the empire still felt to live in another dimension. The Greeks, for example, never accepted the fact that they had been conquered by Rome, which they had, but in their mentality they were the best ever, so they were still living as if they were actually self-ruling in a way, which was true also because the Roman autonomies were pretty large, right? These were not states like the ones we know today that can impose who knows what. Taxation was ridiculous in terms of of our own points percentage, albeit they were way more impacting. In that sense, the system was, in fact, way less potent, right? But the point I wanted to make, especially, is how deeply Rome not only Romanized around, or influenced at least, culturally, at every level, countries that the Romans didn't even know they existed, right? We find Roman stuff up to the Urals, and the Romans didn't even know that Russia was there. And the same influence on the Germanic tribes. There was a deep, you don't stay like half of a millennium bordering the Roman Empire without getting so deeply transformed. And objectively, there is an improvement also of the Germanic people, their organization. We see also their economical potential, the military effectiveness. The same goes for the Persian thing, for the Arsacids, the Sassanids. Actually, there is an enormous factor of Romanization, even just in the construction of the Sassanid Empire, the renovation of its military capability, and so on. Right? We mostly like to see it as the West was besieged by these new external, foreign, non-Roman influences. But have you ever wondered how much just even the fact that you were neighboring this colossal empire? Right? It was truly an ecumenic empire. Just for even just the largest empire standards. Out there was the Parthian kingdom, and the Sassanid Empire was something enormous in comparison, right? Probably in this stabilization, in fact, you had to cope with this enormous thing that, whichever it moved, influenced, impacted you in an incredible way. This is what we often don't get, and this also comes from the misconception of the boundary, right? The concept that there was a limes, like a specific border inside of which you were in Roman Empire, and everybody was Roman in a way, and outside it was different. It was the Barbaricum. It was the place where everybody was free and non-Roman, right? That's absolutely wrong, right? The Romans themselves didn't even properly use the term limes in the way we use today. Probably they didn't, in fact, use them at all in that sense. In origin, the term was the boundary between two camps, and in imperial age it came to define mostly the fortified military road that was, mostly crossing, stretching along these main, mostly river boundaries. The big true boundaries were just geographically the Rhine and the Danube, which also passed, by the way, without too many complications at some levels. The African frontier was so easy, was not even pretty much controlled, right? Were the way less military forces. Most of them, were on the Rhine and Danube. Then was the eastern one, was somewhat floating, depending on how much on the offensive the Romans would get, because usually the Parthians, especially, weren't, they never gave up. They weren't definitely quitters, but they were somewhat incapable at so many levels, even just of intervening by proxy war. Think about all the Jewish revolts. They could have achieved great things. They wouldn't properly. But the concentration, for example, of legions on the Rhine and the Danube, it wasn't much in a defensive sense. In a sense, in and out perspective, those legions were there because they controlled both the peoples who lived on the left bank and the ones on the right bank. Right? They were used to control both of the peoples. This is the perspective. The Romans called it the munimentum. Right? It's like the ammunition, right, in a way. They controlled, on the Rhine, both Gauls and Germans, right? And the Germans, they were controlled, right? They were absolutely also, in continuous contact with Rome. Their aristocracy was, Romanized. They spent time in Rome. They had, think about Arminius, easily was educated in Rome. This was a typical practice, by the way, of every empire, right? With many other peoples that were out there in the same way, right? Even this fact, there were other peoples just compared to just the Germans out there. And there is mostly between the 4th and the 5th century the big movement triggered by the Huns that settled in the in Pannonia, to today's Hungarian plan, basically, giving life to this colossal process of, domino effect of movements that brought to the disgregation of the political imperial system in certain areas of the empire. So we have seen all the stuff. We will talk about the Goths in a while. There were definitely most important populations in this regard, but even at that point, it's not that the Romans suffered a great deal. The same Hunnic threat wasn't this. The Huns could never, for example, settle in the Roman Empire to create an empire on their own to substitute to the Roman. There was no way. There was no potential by the slightest for them. The Germans were also, because they were semi-nomadic. Germans instead were, here the term semi-nomadic, nomadic is fluid. Usually we tend to stress semi-nomadic now for even the steppes peoples, because objectively the steppes are not populated just by purely nomadic populations, right? There are even sedentary populations that were, pretty good sedentary, pretty large and florid sedentary areas in the steppes as well. But let's say that semi-nomadic would apply well also for the Germans in a way, as long as they were on the march, right? So the semi-nomadism is how much you're prone fundamentally to move, where or another, right? And these peoples for a while had problems in these terms, because they wanted to settle within the empire, and that obliged them. It's not that they arrived and they said, okay, well, I don't care about the empire, we have destroyed them. No, they remained always extremely careful and actually very worried about what every single move the empire did, because they could easily be wiped out at any moment, right? And there are multiple and notorious moments in which this actually happened. Even after the loss of the West, quite easily, right? Think about how the Vandals were wiped out by Belisarius, or just the first invasion of Italy during the Gothic War, right? It was frankly embarrassing in the way these systems were wiped out, but there are so many other episodes in this regard. The Visigoths at the time of Majoranus still, right? If it hadn't been for the Vandals that defeated the Romans, in Spain, at that point, the Visigoths would have probably even been, I don't know if resettled, but they would have, because that's what usually the Romans did at that point. And that was a moment, by the way, in which there were way less resources. Also another proof that there was absolutely no deterministic reason for which the western half of the Roman Empire had to fall. That's another narrative you don't have to listen to, because it brings nowhere. It's simply a silly deterministic take on history. It doesn't work. The Western Roman Empire could easily go on. Even up to the 60s of the 5th century, there wasn't nothing specifically settled for its fall. As we've seen here, the term barbarian came from the expression barbar. But it's telling us it's more complex. It's this kind of cacophonic, onomatopoeistic simulation of the non-Hellenic or non-Latin speakers. There is nothing specifically synonymous between German and barbarian. They are two different things. Also here we will not explain once again how even terms like the Celts or the Germans or other peoples are actually Hellenic and Roman ethnographic invention. Right? There is no single proof that these peoples thought of themselves as Germans. Right? It's not how they saw themselves. They had a much narrower understanding of the complexity of their polities, right? They had, of course, a lot in common, but they didn't perceive them as such, right? In the sources, just by the 6th century, when the Romano-Germanic kingdoms are settled, so these peoples are getting Romanized, Latinized, they start writing and calling themselves as vaguely. It's something that took a while, by the way. It was not obvious immediately, right? It took even centuries before it was interiorized, and in fact mostly the areas of Germany didn't even adopt this, right? Because it was in fact a Roman thing to call themselves Germans. There are lots of people who are triggered by this. Once again, we don't care, because we don't care about people that do not even read most updated historiography, and this has nothing to do with any identitary matter. And if you have problems with your own identity relatively to something that happened 2,000 years ago to your alleged ancestors, which sometimes are also very narrowly just taken. Just look at what a genetic cross-section of a normal European, even coming from the north, is about, and where we actually all come from, or very composedly. You have some problem, right? Because it's very difficult to see a specific connection with you in terms of affection, or properly care of a person that lived I don't know how many generations ago, 80 generations ago, right? You have easily more in common with someone who's crossing the street in front of your window right now than with those people. Then if you're romantic or nostalgic about it, as I am myself, telling the truth, yes, okay, but just to be aware that it's a cultural thing. It's not that it actually matters what your ancestors were in practice. And it's a pretty silly and relativistic standpoint to think history and to act just politically or civilly as a consequence. So this is another very... you understand that here I go heavily on every perspective, because frankly I'm fed up just even to remind these things that Lenten maybe it is, but I must tell him, because I presume that actually there is a big problem out there that I've experienced, like just indirectly, sometimes directly as well, but some people just can't accept these things, right? They have some hysterical problem about it. I don't know why. And that, in my opinion, because in fact they haven't conceptualized the historical question as such, right? And what the historical question should mean for people in general. Another point here is the in fact how composed these populations were, to be real honest, because we don't really know, right? I am actually, and after having said this, I can counterbalance the thing by saying that I presume that certain Germanic groups were properly much more ethnically cohesed than this all mixed contaminant migration era perspective was about, right? At least we have no evidence that these peoples were so quantitatively mixed, right? First of all, there were few people, right? Altogether, for example, the Germans were a lot of people, right? But still, for kind of Central Northern European standards, which wasn't a lot, right? And as we've seen, there were much fewer than the Romans, complexively. But especially regarding certain populations, there is no doubt that every of these peoples were, of course, mixed with all type of other populations. We including, of course, the pre-existing one, like the Celts, I don't know, the Thraco-Illyrians. The Roman or Romanized populations were lots of barbarian invasions in which there were actually Romans within the barbarians. The Slavs or Proto-Slavs, the Iranians, like the Sarmatians, the Scythians, these peoples here, the Huns, the Turks. We have plenty of this, and this is confirmed genetically from samples, but it's just we don't know what was the actual difference. And also we should be very aware of one other aspect, that here mostly than people, it's really cultures that traveled, right? Culture is much more pervasive and extensive and dynamic than even just human movement. That is probably also one of the single most underestimated aspects in human history. Of course, people were mixed and came from the most different parts of the world, in even up to Europe at this point. But simply, yeah, it's true. It's true. But how many were they? We do not know. So if you listen to someone who says, no, like we know all these people were completely mixed, it's perfectly fine to represent historically it is as people from every single color, race, language, religion in certain specific contexts, well, it's not really the case, right? It's possible. It's been so like in every single historical period, but to overly emphasize that and to make it pass as factual reality, you're just raping history, right? We have actually some idea of this, right? Especially from the Roman army that is naturally documented. We know like where at least these people were extracted from, provincially speaking. We start knowing that, I don't know, I remember in the 1st century AD, 30% of Roman legionaries came from Gaul. Right, there were lots of Syrians as well, so we kind of understand that, right? Some of these people were, I don't know, even maybe Roman citizens, because they had been settled there by colonies that were eventually recruited again as legionnaires, so these people might have been Italic in origin, and at the beginning, especially at the point, it was mostly the case, but it's obvious that these people married local women, others were simply sons of auxiliaries that had received, the citizenship at the end of the service. So they began to be ever more provincial, naturally, the more time passed. So it's obvious that this was a pretty multicultural empire. There's no doubt about it. But also we have an idea that, unless there are not specific deportations, and in fact migrations en masse, like in the migration era happened, like you don't have this overwhelming ethnic replacement, right? Like, I don't know, let's pick Gaul. Gaul was a pretty well-populated area, even since, of course, before the Roman conquest. It's not that the Celtic background there was ethnically, subverted, eliminated, replaced. Right, people began to speak Roman so much that France today is a Neo-Latin country, and this is quite interesting, by the way. Of course, half of a millennium of Roman domination has its own impact, but the point is that the people, more or less, that were there were fundamentally the same. Surely it was a consistent, colonization from Italy at the time of the conquest. But also at an ethnical point of view, it does make a difference. We know it. You know why? Because also most of the Romance languages that are spoken Europe-wide are and especially the ones that have the S termination, like especially in Spain or Portugal, or also certain aspects in the Balkans, in Romania, derive specifically not from classical Latin as we know it. So the language allegedly spoken in Rome, and more specifically actually by the elite of Rome, but by italics, right? So peoples that were Romanized, were Romans, fully Roman citizens at that point, for example, the time of expansion of the empire, but that spoke, I don't know, Pisanian or Umbrian or Samnitic, right? And that had different dialects, different accents, different languages, like easily said, and that transplanted it there wherever they were settled. This is quite fascinating, and it is true. But let's say it's unlikely that there was, other than, of course, the Romans sent their own legionaries to properly colonize, so that was a thing that was most proper. Also the early empire, and it mostly came from Italy itself, all Mediterranean wide, and in Europe wide. But after that, we don't see that. There were, of course, a lot of nuclei of people coming from literally everywhere, right? You would find, I don't know, Africans, Syrians, in Britain, of course, in Gaul there was a lot of them. We find Jews, people traveled far and wide along the empire. I just think that in terms of sheer demographics, the basis was not properly touched. And I tell you also why, because contrary to what it was believed, this was, of course, the Roman Empire was an empire of cities, and the empire worked on the cities. But the majority of the population lived in the countryside, right? The Roman countryside was also dynamic, but never quite in the not even in the medieval sense of it. Those were the majority of the peoples. Those peoples didn't change, right? We have a concrete idea of that. They changed in many ways culturally, linguistically. They surely assimilated other groups. And talking about during the Roman domination, it's obvious that during the migration era, this was the ethnic differences were accentuated. But most of the movements we can track in the empire are urban, right? They mostly pertain to the elites. They traveled a lot. Hell, the Roman Empire had even an Arab emperor. It was normal. It was perfectly normal. That was the mindset of the ancient world, right? There wasn't like a culture out there that made a fuss about such things. It was not just pertaining to the Romans, right? Also, the Hellenistic world, in spite of Hellenic xenophobia, had been very mixed at many levels. But still, right, the fact, for example, I studied specifically the Longobards over time. There is this idea that there were Sarmato-Germanic peoples. Sarmato-Germanic people specifically. I personally tell you, seen most of the sources about them, there is no evidence of that. There is no evidence of this, even by nomic dichotomy, so that they weren't Germans but Sarmato Germans. Why? Right? No doubt there were massive, but not even Sarmatian influences, but coming even from I don't know, from Siberia easily. There's nothing strange about that. But quantitatively speaking, how different were they? I know, because they had horse archers, and so why? Because a German cannot learn how to horse archery. What the hell, right? Humans are dramatically adaptable. So if you find a cultural influence, a strong cultural influence, fine. It doesn't necessarily have to happen because of an immixtion of masses of aliens, let's say. It doesn't function like that, right? And this absolutely doesn't exclude the fact that these peoples were mixed. That were surely important quotas of Sarmatians within the Longobard people. Just we don't have the heckin' idea of how much they were, right? Also, banally, how many could these people be, right? Most of what we see in this regard is also, we mostly interpret these movements like an avalanche, right? But how could the Huns be? Like, how many were they? Do you think we know? Like, there is a much greater impact that even very tiny populations can, not saying that the Huns were specifically, But take the Germans in the Roman territories. These were a minority, but they managed to invade and to control, of course with the support of the local population, eventually these kingdoms, right? And there are complex dynamics. If we mostly look at the migration era playlist, you can understand better. But the point is, it's very easy, even for a bunch of people, to control way larger amounts, and that is almost exclusively explained because these larger amounts are fine with the arrival and the management from the side of these peoples, right? Because even in this whole process, we do not see like extreme xenophobic attitudes, if not in terms of for reasons of sheer political control, right? All we get from archaeologically, culturally, in the art, we see that there was a syncresis, and that the most common people we can't think they were fine with these migrations, because of course they messed up the whole thing at many levels. But first of all, many areas had remained simply without population and were partially filled by these peoples that, by the way, rarely managed to settle in the most intensely Romanized and to control them fully. That is also an important thing, without being absorbed by them on the long run. And secondly, there is no evidence of this cultural clash that we're so obsessed about today, right? And this has nothing to do with the fact that this was objectively a very brutal period at all levels, but there were much more serious and cogent and evident political and military problems connected to that than whatever the peasant could care of who was his ruler at this point, right? Because his life sucked anyway, right? So sometimes it was actually better to have a Germanic rule that was, for example, had a much lighter fiscal pressure, so much that we know easily that there were certain Romans that fled Roman territory to go live into the Germanic one because they had it easier, right, and became German in the juridical sense of the world. This is how also it happened. The Romano-Germanic kingdoms, without exception, are all properly, we call them Romano-Germanic, but they're properly Germanic. Like, it's not that they are saying we are Romans in any way. So juridically, these people could be Romans or Germans, but they're still living under properly a Germanic system that eventually tends to Germanize them on the long run, right? So that there were areas that were, deeply Romance, right? That in early medieval times he said, we are Germans. Look at Liutprand of Cremona, ambassador of Otto the First to Constantinople. I mean, he was basically an Italian. He was but he said, we are Germans because why? Because I'm a Longobarд at the time. Because at the time, every inhabitant there had been a Longobard, by historically speaking, and that's how they reasoned, like also in ideological terms. So this is like, I realize we haven't discussed this much thoroughly in detail with single examples, but this is properly the idea we should get. That of all the things that sucked badly in that world, who was the ruler was one of the least important. The important there was that the ruler could provide order. And that's also what many Germanic rules actually managed to provide, right? There is no doubt, that Ostrogothic Italy was much happier than under the late Roman, the last years of the Western Roman Empire. If you read Gregory of Tours for Gaul, the Franks had done a pretty good job in there. It's plenty of this evidence, right? There are not these turmoilous realities for which I said, no, we don't want these Germans anymore. It's usually happening in very important centers of powers that we'll see mostly in Constantinople. But even in here, the world of a city is something, the world of the countryside is a completely different one, and especially we don't know it well, right? And which is a pretty euphemistic way to actually mean that we have almost no idea of what it concretely was. It's mostly a hypothesis. especially for what concerns this later times. It starts to be way less documented, right? Also, when did this thing begin practically? What is that the Romans and the Germans began to live together fundamentally? Well, easily, the Romans conquered Germany. Like, for 20 years, before the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, Germany was being dealt with as any other peripheral province. Actually, the Romans didn't think much of the Germans after Caesar had defeated them and the Teutonic thing had been erased. There is all the problem of the senatorial historiography. It tells us the history, even of things like the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, the specific reasons why an important part of the Roman aristocracy didn't want to expand in Germany, that might have even pictured the land in grimmer terms than it actually was, right? I also usually stress the divide between Gaul and Germany, for example, and objectively there was, right? Objectively there was. But it is important also to stress is that the Romans didn't give up the idea of invading Germany. Marcus Aurelius, before dying, was preparing the invasion of Germany. Maximin the Trajan also was actually invaded Germany, also in a very different context. But let's say that the Romans had never given up the idea, right? Even if it seems objectively disadvantageous, and objectively there is a reason also why for example, the Romans had invaded Germany at the beginning just because they weren't concerned much about it, but about Bohemia, right? They wanted to make this pincer movement from the Danube and from the Rhine against the Marcomanni, right? Western Germany to them was nothing, right? They had conquered it pretty easily. There was really nothing that they cared. So in fact, that this also brought to lower the guard, because said this were a bunch of primitives. There was nothing to fear from them, so we know how it's gone, and this also is one of the most dramatic historical consequences in the history of the world, like the fact that Germany was not Romanized, right? The Romans abandoned it and renounced to its conquest. That this is something that changed the world history of Europe forever, right? Tiberius was the first one to give up, basically. Albeit he was one of the generals that actually had conquered Germany. And Tiberius is dramatically underestimated. He was one of the greatest generals in Roman history. And we mostly just know about the creepy gossip of Flavian historiography, as about most of the Julio-Claudians that were all hell of emperors, including Caligula and Nero. Especially Nero was one of the greatest emperors in Roman history. Also, these things, we never discussed them yet, because we also make Roman history videos. Lots of people say, oh no, Nero was just a depraved, crazy thing, killed. Yeah, okay. Keep reading Flavian historiography as if it was a factual reality, and Nero will always remain a monster, of course. But even if he had been, he was still a pretty damn capable ruler. And this is what is often forgotten as well, because people were objectively that weird at the time. We still are, but still that we can't contextualize overall. So, as we were saying before, especially the populations around the Danube and the Rhine began to orbit within the imperial system. Right, they were periphery of it, but they were pretty well connected to. The East was different because the East had millenary civilization. It was also more distant from Rome. Rome had, broadly speaking, that there is a specific Latin Germanic dimension that, as you know, in Schwerpunkt we try to stress. Also in our, especially medieval history videos, that is important at the root of what was the Roman Empire, what would become eventually its eastern part, that is instead mostly an Hellenistic reality, right? There are important divides in this sense. It doesn't matter that the Romans had managed to operate as syncresis. There are still different mentalities, different ways of thinking. There are still today, right? There's a very specific combination that the Roman invasion of Celtic, in Iberian Europe, and its eventual Germanic mixture produced, right? Compared just differently from the Balkans, or also the Near East. Although certain areas of Central Northern Europe were there are still important divides in this sense. They are complex to discuss, but maybe one day we will do it. The East was more self-emanating, culturally speaking, right? Also Rome, as you know, was deeply influenced from these areas, and still they were more distant. They probably were the areas that felt Rome the least after Rome, right? These other Central European populations instead felt deeply because they were much more tied to them. They were, in a way, much more obliged to cope with it than the East practically was. Right? As we've seen, the chieftains of these peoples had frequent contacts with the imperial court. The German warriors were enlisted in the Roman army. Groups of free Germans, of freemen properly, individually, were settled as colonists in the various regions of the empire. We're talking since the time of Caesar, of Augustus, right? Look at Alla Ubriorum, one of the greatest successes of Roman-Germanic integration, historically speaking, in Augustan times. Right, there was really nothing conflictual about the two peoples. Right, that's mostly a modern invention, in a way. Right, it stems from also late historiographical cliches, but it was also especially reinforced by 19th century ethno-nationalist and racist historiographies. Right, that needed to stress this deep divide between these two systems, the unicity of certain cultures. As if, we know pretty well that all these groups were pretty open to each other, in many ways. We know of Germans. We were talking about the video on the Battle of Strasbourg that were introduced to Hellenistic cults into the Roman Rhineland, right? As free Germans from non-Roman Germany, right? They simply entered there because they believed that it functioned, right? Paganism was like that, right? So these are all very important perspectives to bear in mind. Trade, right? Trade was actually one of the most important indicators of Romanization. We know of luxury products flowing to the north, weapons, food, right? Culture, even artistical cultural influxes. In exchange of natural products as mostly force, slaves, right? Because you think, the Romans, terrible enslavers, evil guys, these poor tender peoples were so free and happy. Yes, like all the tribal peoples that have been doing nothing else throughout all their entire existence but enslaving each other and selling them to the foreigners, right? This is what happened everywhere, right? The tribal reality is exclusively about that. The Germans spent their entire reality, their entire existence, fighting against each other, and the Roman, whoever arrived, right? But that was the only way to ensure just even survival at certain levels, right? These systems changed over time, in part thanks to Romanization, importantly thanks to Romanization, in part also because of sheer improvement, as any community or human community tends to do. But it's not that they weren't exposed to civilization. Right, even the geographical dimension here has an importance, right? Because the contacts with Germany weren't as like the same with Scandinavia or Eastern Europe, right? And these were important factors, even in a medieval perspective, to the spread of certain. Before we were making a difference between Romanization and Roman influence. Right, the Germans were mostly Roman influenced after all, right? Aside from those that actually came into the empire, became Roman, so that's properly Romanization. But certain Germans were very scarcely Romanized. After all, the Germans who were more Romanized were the ones that came from the eastern side, right? The Goths mostly. Those were the most Romanized Germans because probably they were the earlier to enter into the Roman boundaries. but also because they were kind of more stratified, more systemically complex, right? Because of also the migration, they had gathered lots of other peoples under their control, right? Peoples like that would become dramatically important, that are often credited to be, early Romanized, like the Franks. Actually, they weren't Romanized at all, if not very superficially, right? So this is another perspective is often poorly framed. The volume of exchanges reached between Roman Germany reached its apex between the 12th and the 3rd centuries. So exactly, at the end of this period, you have these German confederacies that start to set themselves in motion and to start doing pretty upsetting things that the Romans, after all, for a couple of centuries, were able to regularly check. After all, the worst thing that happened to Rome throughout all this period were Romans fighting against themselves. Surprise, surprise. What's the greatest enemy of a Roman? Another Roman, of course. What's the other greatest enemy of German? Another German, right? It's like that. It's always been like that. However, ever more frequent incursions followed, as you know, during the 3rd century, but always because the Romans were essentially destroying each other and splitting the empire in various ways. And so the Germans say, you know what, let's attack. This is what always happens historically speaking, right? Most of these invasions are, especially at this time in the 3rd century, weren't a cause of Roman destruction as much as a consequence of Roman destruction, right? Because every history has told us that every single time an empire collapses, all those other martyrs, pirates, and here was plenty of them, the Franks and the Goths toured the whole Black Sea, Mediterranean, right, all North Sea, right, and pirate ships that have never been seen since the times of Pompey, right. It all starts when the big animal, the big empire, the big system starts decomposing, right. And this system is not dead yet, after all, and it's actually very far from being dead. Not only manages to counter these movements, but also to strengthen itself, especially during the 4th century. Right? During the 4th century, the empire is objectively, by any standard, improving. Right? It's on the rise again. Right? It's not declining at all. You have to wait, chiefly this other moment that will come to destabilize the political balance of the empire. That is between the 4th and the 5th century, connected, as we've seen, to the Huns, right? We're talking about mostly what began with the Gothic migration, most of what we call Visigoths that actually weren't called like that. That's also another ethnographical thing that the Romans attached to them and that we copy wrongly, because it's something that Cassiodorus in the 6th century wrote when he was in Ostrogothic Italy, so he distinguished the Western Goths in Spain, right? It was also the least important compared to the Ostrogoths at that point, but we call them Visigoths, and we think that they were called like that, right? That they weren't, right? Also, the Ostrogoths properly didn't even exist as such, right? They were being, first of all, let's say assimilated, to be euphemistic, by the Hunnic wave. We also lose track of them on the radar, right? The Ostrogoths repop out after the Hunnic Empire is done, right? So this is also very fascinating, because always consider that whatever happened, and then you wonder why we study Roman history, because whatever happened beyond the Roman frontiers, if it is not documented by Roman historiography, is unknown, right? It's not the true archaeology, what happened there. Archaeology only tells you that there are certain groups of peoples that, however, are not tagged, right? They are mostly, in terms of material culture, they're mostly homogeneous. You don't understand what they are most of the times. You have no way to distinguish them from one another. You have problems to date whatever they were. So, what can you get in terms of their political military history? Nothing. There are peoples that, in fact, until they are not recognized by Roman diplomacy, we know nothing about, right? We can't guess what they were doing. There are lots of hints actually about it, And I presume that also at this point, the most what is being said about them is mostly what we have to get away with forever, right? In the sense that there is no new discovery that is going to radically redraw what we know about peoples like the Goths, the Longobards. All these populations came mostly from a Central Eastern European dimension, because that's it. Yeah, we can keep finding graves, burials, stuff like that, but they're not going to add a known political historical relation to known groups that are concretely identifiable, that we haven't known from written sources from the civilized world, right? So, as you know, the history of the Goths here, we don't descend into details, but they had been actually, let's say, welcomed by the Romans, which is a kind of another euphemism, in Thrace by 375. These guys were starving to death, basically. They needed to cross the Danube, and it was being carried out by Roman authorities that were fairly corrupted, like all governments all over history, in the sense that, especially pre-industrial times, there is no civilization without corruption, right? Every single system is corrupted. For not talking about of these other tribal peoples that do not even know what public authority means, and the Romans are selling them, like they're buying, they essentially letting them pass in exchange for their freedom. They make them sell their children as slaves. They're exploiting them. So these guys are pretty pissed, and they enter the area, and they manage to defeat famously and clamorously the Roman army at Adrianople in 378. Is Adrianople the beginning of the end of the empire? No, right? There is no such thing like the beginning of the end of something that of an end that happened more than 1,000 years later, right? So Adrianople, no, is not the beginning of the end. It's not properly even what triggers what will bring to the end, because after Adrianople, the Romans, after 10 years, have already a larger army than the one that has been defeated at Adrianople, that is fighting against another large army that is made up of, according to you, other Romans, right? So in terms of, Adrianople as having crippled the military capabilities of the empire, it's a world of baloney, right? It's absolutely false, wrong historically. The Visigoths, or whatever they were to say, the Goths better, settled in Thrace, where they began to be a pretty sound pain in the behind, because these peoples are not, as we were saying, calm or particularly peaceful on their own, and they naturally occupy these areas that Thrace wasn't dramatically Romanized, but it was just very close to important centers of the east of what is now the eastern half of the empire, and therefore the Romans are trying to dilute them in some ways. Many of them are actually hired in the army, and the post-Adrianople phase is just the only moment in which you can objectively speak of all Roman history, in which foreigners have constituted briefly a problem for the discipline, the control of the same troops, right? The whole Theodosian policy was centered on the concept that basically not only that these peoples had been subdued from the Roman perspective, right? This is what they were thinking to the mob, right? But also that they had been transformed from brutal barbarians into Roman citizens is a big word, because now Roman citizens factually do not understand anymore that they're Roman subjects proper, after the 3rd century especially. But they're fundamentally still employed, functionally speaking. I mean, the Visigoths pay this huge blood tribute fighting for Rome, right? It's incredible, actually, how for barbarian standards, how disciplined, how consensual they were with the Romans to get themselves killed regularly in some of the most daring and hopeless military situations all over the imperial boundaries, right? As you know, as Adrianople Valens had died, I mean, it had been a pretty dramatic thing, but these guys are okay with the idea of coexisting in the area, and yet in these ambiguous terms that will bring them at some point to launch raids into Greece, into Macedon, into the Illyricum, and even in the Po Valley, where in 401 they sacked Aquileia, and they threatened Milan. That was the capital, at least. I mean, Rome was always the capital, but Milan was the most important center, together with Trier in the west. That's where the court was. That's where, at the moment in which, in fact, the court was transferred to Ravenna, where it would remain till the end of the empire. And it's here that the most famous duo of the time, like Stilicho and Alaric, fight in a relation that is easily cat and mouse, right? The Visigoths could be wiped out in at least 3 distinct chances. This wasn't done because basically the western and eastern half were quarreling. But there was a moment in which not only the Visigoths were openly defeated by the imperial army in open field and obliged to retreat and could have been literally exterminated, right? But at that time, the Romans didn't exterminate anymore because they always saw these guys as a pawn that they could use either politically, in a broader scheme. At that point, Stilicho was Roman general, magister militum, as Alaric actually had been appointed also by the Eastern Roman emperors for the East. We've seen these things just to piss the Westerners off, so it was actually a pretty complicated thing. The Easterners didn't want the Goths, the Westerners either, but they were using them to cripple each other in a way, or at least to get to the top, to control, right? It's not that the two halves were, I mean, they were in competition, but they weren't opposed as two different empires, right? They were, after all, cooperative. So, eventually, there is this brutal anti-Germanic reaction in the West, even before then in the East, that brings to some atrocious things, like the Western Emperor exterminating Gothic women and children. Stilicho himself is actually put to death because he was accused of treason, of having played with these Germans and not having destroyed them in time for his own political ambitions. And that's when actually Alaric sacks Rome, which, considering in fact what the Romans had just done to their families, I mean, was an extremely moderate sack, right? First of all, the Germans were very superstitious, as much as the Romans in many ways. They feared to trigger the Roman deities, right? Doesn't matter here it's Christian times or pagan times, it's still in between. It's a very moderate sack. Just there is no archaeological evidence, but a very few, just a single fire in a peripheral area of the city, and it was just a regulated sack. They took away the riches, etc., but they didn't do much harm more, because the official excuse was that the Goths hadn't been paid as soldiers at that point, like the other Romans, as now these federati, so the allies were being used in the same way. It was the same Roman armies. Even the differences in equipment, in training are loose. So famously, the sack of Rome is, in fact, nothing concretely happened. The worst thing that happened to Rome was during the Gothic War, right? During the Ostrogothic siege by Vitiges, that wasn't aimed at harming Rome for the sake of an anti-Roman feeling, because the Goths were ruling Italy and they thought it was their home by now, as we will see in a while. It was just that, as you know, the Byzantines at that point had invaded the peninsula, had besieged Rome, so that's where they cut the aqueducts, where most of the people flees, is deported, dies. That's the blow. The Visigothic sack, the Vandal sack, others that happened. Actually, didn't cause damage to Rome in a great sense. I mean, it was always the great city it had always been, and it remained there. There were now other important centers were rising to be were more important politically, and especially also strategically than Rome. But Rome was was always there, so it would remain throughout all the early, throughout all the Middle Ages, Modern Age. There is this great continuity that also with the Church that basically doesn't change. Rome is never lost. Rome is in the West, in Western history throughout all late antiquity, early Middle Ages, is the single most influent cultural center in Western Europe. Right, all this process of Christianization, of acculturation, of alliteration, civilization those missions start from Rome. It's the largest city. It's the one from the greatest culture emanates. It's from which the Church of Rome regulates the churches of all the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. It already becomes a central point that had never lost as a Rome, right? So when Rome is sacked, though, and here we can't digress about the meaning that the concept of being undefeated and the military glory of the skies that is at the base of all these either Romans and Germans religious and moral visions, parameters, and essence, all right, as a mentality, naturally produces a great cultural shock. Like all the authors of the time, they're at this point by late antiquity mostly elite in a way. Also, the same church actually that are extremely traumatized by this event because they realized that was something concerning the relation with the deity now that had been broken, and there was at this time all the still Christian and pagan clash that actually was much less violent than one thinks it is, and as it's exemplified by the fact that these people wrote all these works, either Christian or pagan, still at the time, and where paganism remained even for a long time after the official declaration of Christianity as religion of the empire. This is another thing that many people do not accept. They have to stress that either Christianity is the worst thing ever, or the best thing ever, or conversely, the paganism is the worst thing ever, best thing ever. Here we don't care. We just state what we see, and what we see is this constant continuity, and that most of the clashes that occurred were connected to other political problems within the local communities. There was actually a big deal of repression, it is true, but it was diluted in nature. Also was at some point more concentrated in the Eastern Roman Empire than in the Western, where objectively the same Roman senatorial elite was, very philo-pagan, if not openly pagan, up to a very late time, and that also in the Christian reality, this cultural influences remained. All what the church cared about was the elites. If the peasantry remained pagan, who the hell care? Who the hell cares about the peasantry? Do you think that these elites actually gave a damn about the peasant? We have to enter in the mentality that at this time is being modified, also thanks to Christianity, but to the fact that this was a world in which, you had a slave, you could kill him or her, whatever you liked, and nobody cared because it was your legal right to do it. This is the banal contempt that you have to human life. A completely different physicality, which doesn't mean that these were superheroes by the slightest. But it was a completely different life, a completely different mentality, a completely different moral vision of the world that only at this time starts taking a form in a more humanistic sense, also thanks to the principle of equality of all men in the eye of God, but there was also something that had been stated about this in the pagan reality, but had remained mostly on paper, or better, on papyrus. Let's put it in this way: the Goths famously eventually settled in Aquitaine. Eventually, they will go into Spain and so on. The important thing about this is the first settlement of the Goths in 418 basically an autonomous people, an entire people within the boundaries of the empire. This is the real discriminant of the migration era in many ways, right? Up to Adrianople, this problem hadn't existed. No people had ever settled en masse in the Roman Empire. They had always been diluted and dispersed, sometimes, very large amounts of people, but always in a way that had, become Romanized and lived within the boundaries without particular problems, right? It's not that at this time the Roman subjects themselves were very easy to treat. And telling the truth, the federati, from fedus, that in Latin means alliance, were interested in respecting the contract in a way. Of course, they would also do whatever they wanted in terms of they were a polity now in areas where the empire was dissipating its control. So, but they cared extremely about the Roman legitimization. This would become almost an obsession in terms of replicating the imperial authority in their own, local ruling ideology. Let's say that the fact that they were legitimized by the same deity, by the same authority that kept holding the ecumenic empire. There's no thing like a moment in which the western half disappears. So these guys are on their own. They don't care about Rome. Constantinople is always there, and up to Anglo-Saxon England, they freaking care about it, right? Even if they couldn't maybe even arrive to northern Gaul at some point, but they had an impact. There were enormous interests gravitating around this, and the only model of possible in this sense was specifically the Roman Empire, right? They wanted to share its power. They wanted to share the magic that their divinity had made them rule the entire world. What are these people obsessed by? What's the only goal of these leaders? Is to rule, right, blessed by the military deity of the sky. That's what they want, and they think they can obtain it magically, concretely, right, in a way that is still very contractualistic, because these people, even if when they're Christian, they maintain a wholly pagan contractualism in terms of what the relations are entailed between the deity and mankind. But it's all about the glory of conquest and rule. In ancient times, objectively, there is no other moral parameter, right? Just in the monotheisms, there are certain differences in this regard. There are other philosophies that stress the detachment from the earthly aspects, but those are things that develop, in fact, in realities that are actually controlled by someone else. And in fact, most of the people may take this refuge in them. Christianity, in part, was the same thing, telling the truth. It has much in common also with Eastern other Eastern philosophies and religions, but it's quite unique and also in its own Judeo-Christian essence. But properly, there is no other, like if you're a ruler, there is no single other model. You are there to conquer the entire world as possible, and the Romans are the only ones that made it practically, that at least maintained this over time. Of course, as we were saying before, also in the East there were other models. For example, the same Romans were fascinated and obsessed in their own way with Alexander the Great. So these are things that will be transmitted also in the medieval epics. The medieval epics is not about Caesar; it's about Alexander, right? And so that makes you understand properly what were the inspirational models, right? Not pietistic, pacific, constructive, civil. In the sense, better civil, yes, because if what the Roman citizenship entailed was also the participation to that glory, to that military god, but it was something extremely aggressive, right, in its essence, right, and also exclusivistic in a way. The fact that Romans had extended their citizenship had nothing to do with the fact that they didn't value it as such, right? It was a privilege, and if you were a Roman citizen, you were superior to others. Right, and that's because the Romans had conquered the world. So the gods had wanted them to rule over other peoples, and that was what they were legitimized to do, right? Here, these are very harsh realities, but that's exactly from what we come, right? We are full of Roman symbolism in all over Western governments, emblems, symbols, etc., architecture. We come from that, from a mostly expansionistic, aggressivistic, militaristic state, religious state. By the way, never forget that Rome was based solely, and the Roman Empire more specifically, was based solely on a religious principle. There was nothing else, right? And I'm not saying it's a negative thing. I mean, I'm saying that it is what it is. So we have to care about its deeper meaning. Because if you want to make of the Roman Empire a 19th century nation state, that's not going to lead you very far, right? This was the only way possible to conceive a power in the ancient world, military and religious, which are not two separate things, are the same thing, right? Because there is no military glory without gods, or God, because also in the Christian dimension, all these values at a cultural level, at practical level, also in the army, etc., remain identical, right, for centuries and centuries. And not up to a very few centuries ago, which we actually substituted that with a cult of laicism and statalism, or national, all this stuff, but it's essentially the same aggressivistic concept of, I am this thing and you are something else, hence either we find an agreement or we go at war fundamentally, or at least we remain in conflict. Once again, there would be a lot to add, but we can't. More of that on Schwerpunkt, and more of that actually to be found already on Schwerpunkt, because we talked about this stuff extensively by this point. There is this first, however, with the gods of Alaric and the extermination of their families in Italy, we have, a kind of a xenophobic, anti-German specifically attitude, but it's not something actually very characteristic of the Western provinces, right? Not even of Italy itself. It's mostly in the Eastern Roman Empire, right? As facts would prove, by the way, in the following centuries, where there was a sound integration, right? The Ostrogoths in Italy are the most perfect example of Roman-Germanic integration in history, right? And there were still the Roman elites governing together with the Germanic army, right? So it's something very specifically that has to do both with the Romans and the Germans at the same time. In the East, instead, there is by, perhaps, I used to say by Hellenic influence, right? But naturally it's not a cultural thing. There were specific political and military interests, but let's say that there is also a stronger state, there is a greater capability of rejection in the main pressures. After all, the East had managed to send the Goths in the West, so also the eastern half had been Germanized in a way, in the sense that many Germans had been integrated into this system. At a certain point, there is a strong reaction that happens in Constantinople against the Germanic military hierarchies that were now playing the local policy. So this was surely some to feelings of hostility with a xenophobic background, but objectively was also moved by a specific problem of power and governability. So there is the extermination at the beginning of the 5th century. We have seen it in the video on the Theodosian dynasty we made recently, of the Germans, the Gothic general Gainas, together in fact with thousands of his connationals, let's say. And this is important because for a while, objectively, the barbarian infiltration ceased, at least at the higher levels, right? after a couple of decades, Germanic generals would come back in the Eastern Roman Empire regularly in the same way. But Constantinople started to become, in this sense, also thanks to all the advantages that now we can't list about the Eastern half, why it was like more manageable, it was richer, it had simply more cash, it was better placed, it had important infrastructures, it was more intensely urbanized in certain areas, at least in the core areas of the empire, including Constantinople had risen, as you know, as the main center, even if it was a city de facto of new foundation compared also to the older Byzantium. And to start, organizing itself in a kind of anti-barbarian sense, also from a political and strategical point of view, because this area was much more exposed, especially from the Pontic steppe or the Black Sea, aside from the eastern Persian frontier, that at least were stable in the sense that the Persians were sedentary. But, from these waves of peoples that crossed that, from Eurasia, that invested the northern borders, and that caused this direct pressure actually in the same Constantinople. Right, Constantinople is much more, exposed to the frontier geographically than Rome is, for example, in a way, right? But this is, in fact, just to prove that, of course, geopolitics as such does not exist, and in the West, as a reaction, there were certain moments, of course, of closure, right, we could say, that were alternated, however, with attempts to integrate the barbarian populations that were pouring at this point, especially after 406, like crazy, especially in Gaul, and crossing chiefly to Spain and to Africa eventually. The pragmatic solutions were the formulas of the Federatio and the Hospitalitas. The Federatio was, as we've seen, this alliance. This is the idea that there was the officialization of an alliance between the Roman Empire and these peoples that became hence Federati, that were settled through the Hospitalitas. That instead was this practice of settling specifically the people, giving them like usually 1/3 of the local land, which in practice didn't quite mean that 1/3 superficially of the land was given to them, but simply that they were settled somewhere and that they got like 1/3 of the of the local resources, from especially of the military administration, the annona, to maintain their own army, theoretically, in the service of Rome. Right, then the practical reality is very different, because these guys settle and basically control the local resources, but there is still a Roman administration there, and that's the one with whom they have to negotiate a lot of things, right? Because as we were saying before, these are, after all, are just normally a few tens of thousands warriors. So in a single battle could be wiped out. We had to be very, very careful about what they did, right? Because otherwise their entire people would go destroyed. And actually they played it fairly well, right? There is no people in here just properly destroyed, if not after a long sedentarization, and usually after a crisis, like it would happen in Vandal Africa or Ostrogothic Italy. And Visigothic Spain went pretty damn close to that, right? Actually, there were some peoples who were defeated, if you count, for example, the Burgundians. Right? Burgundians were properly... the reason here, all the problem of the Hunnic invasions, that in many ways, Europe is split in two. That is to say that there is all the Roman part and the Hunnic part. So the problem is that the Germans are somewhere, right? And they are either in the Hunnic-dominated part or in the Roman-dominated part. So what occurs here is that the Burgundians were they were settled across the Rhine. They were trying to play both sides in a way. So Aetius, that we'll see now, got tired of that and disposed of them. So he basically defeated them. The same Nibelungenlied is actually singing all this thing. That is referring to this fact loosely. And they are resettled in the Sepaudia, in south eastern Gaul, in the Alps, where they will remain. And in fact, they will not play much of a role anymore because they had been crippled. That Burgundy will remain as an entity, as you know, but they will not be as lively as the Franks or the Alemanni, for example, were just there. Except the Alemanni were actually crushed by the Franks at some point. But this thing of the two sides, right, was very important because the Germans had properly to choose whether to stay from one side or another. Famously, the Visigoths stayed under Rome, the Ostrogoths under the Huns. They found themselves at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, right, in 451. The same goes actually with bans for every kind of people, right? Of course, under Attila and under Aetius at that point, there were, groups of war bands that came from the same people sometimes. It's very easy, telling the truth. Also because there was an internal debate between within the Germanic peoples, properly the single ones, to whether stay with Roman or the Huns, right? Here we can't digress once again, but there is all the problem about accepting Romanization. There is a certain historiography that tends to stress that entire peoples like the Franks, for example, were moved altogether by this desire of Romanity. The thing is way more complex, right? Nobody here was happy to enter, to change, to do this radical choice. So there was always a pro-Roman and pro-Germanic party, and sometimes the Huns themselves catalyzed the pro-Germanic one in the sense that, of course, they were used in anti-Roman function as long as the empire held, the Hunnic Empire, Dominion, whatever we're going to call it, held, but properly tended to strengthen their elites, which, historically speaking, in the Germanic world was something that the people had always tried to avoid, right? And in fact, it's not surprising that those peoples that had stayed longer under Hunnic control, generally speaking, had developed a fairly higher level of social stratification and political verticization than others that were more egalitarian-minded, let's say, like the Franks, right, that stayed mostly under Rome. Of course, also Rome played a bit like that, trying to, not to cope with all these separated kings that made up these peoples, but electing one. The same had happened with Alaric, after all, that was backed by Rome, in a sense, to be a single political referent for the imperial authorities, because otherwise it would have been a mess to control them in the first place. Because, of course, every clan did whatever the heck they liked, including raiding into imperial territory. So that was an issue as well. That these kings, in a positive sense, objectively contained, right? So there is a process of civilization going on in all these. Naturally, through the hospitalitas, as it's evident, especially in the case of the Franks or the Visigoths, etc., the Germanic populations would form powers on their own, right? Rome will, at some point, will never come back to say, okay, now you are a former subject or ally, technically, but, still, here there was all the problem of who has the upper hand, right? Because federatus means technically just an ally, it doesn't mean a subject, right? Or, right, there were different titles. There was the amicus Romae, for example. There were very ambiguous titles, because, of course, these peoples, also in early imperial times, always thought that they were somewhat more autonomous than what surely the Romans thought about them being. However, the hospitalities, generally speaking, worked. As we've seen, the settlement of these Germans actually brought to some stability after all. Gregory of Tours said, yeah, well done. Finally we have a leadership here, instead of no one, or these waves of peoples that pass, ravage, and do not settle. Also because objectively those countries that were not settled were ravaged at the passage. Just for example, what the Vandals did in Spain, before settling in Africa. But actually, when they settle in Africa, there is no proof of a terrible oppression, destruction. Is the myth of the Vandals as a bunch of thugs is just mostly an anti-Aryan thing that emanates, derived historiographically from Papal and Byzantine historiography about the Vandals. But also there were double standards there, because also the Goths were Aryans religiously, and they weren't dealt like that. So also to prove that religion was not really even the discriminant in there. We speak also of a sort of Vandal renaissance. So we do not exaggerate when we say that the populace, after all, was fine with this, right? Was satisfied at least with a final stabilization after sometimes centuries of problems of continuous trouble and so on. But in all this, as you understand, properly the boundaries of the empire, at least for what concerns its areas of direct influence and control, are being redrawn, right? At the beginning of the 5th century, properly the frontiers of the empire fell, right? In order to cope with the Visigoths, for example, and notably, the bulk of the army had been redrawn into Italy. Therefore, this uncovering the northern borders. Britain was abandoned notoriously in 406, right? For which the islands actually were exposed to the continuous incursions of the Picts, of the Scots, coming chiefly from today's Scotland and Ireland, as you know, but other peoples, including actually Scandinavians, right, that sometimes played against these guys or together with them. We're talking specifically of Scandinavians, not just because eventually the Anglo-Saxons will, the Jutland is considered, at least culturally, southern Scandinavia. It's eventually participated as groups that came, as we know, as far from Sweden, for example. So the most important Anglo-Saxon finds are actually even Scandinavian proper. Even in there, the settlement of overseas populations was normal. If I'm not wrong, the Litus Saxonicum, that is basically the Saxon shore in eastern Britain, had been created by the Romans as an administrative area, the region, to cope militarily with the raids, with the sea raids of these people, since if I'm not wrong, from the 2nd century AD. And there were, in the meanwhile, lots of these peoples that were settling peacefully, coming via sea, on boats on the eastern frontier, in Britain, broadly meant. This is important because it makes you understand that even these northern populations were pretty well aware of what Rome was. Let's not mention the overwhelming evidence of Germanic warriors that went normally having a living as Roman soldiers, say in the Roman army as foederati, or also through other forms of hiring, and fought their whole life all over the empire. Preferably, mostly was in Gaul, in these closer areas. But at the end of their service, they would come back to Germany. We find inscriptions even in Denmark. People said that they were proud Germans as much as proud Roman veterans. And think even about all the technical military know-how, right? How ideas circulate. So no surprise that these people knew the places, knew how the system worked, and interacted with it in many ways. Britain is a very fascinating scenario about which, unfortunately, we know probably the least of any other Roman province by this time. What happened there was something pretty upsetting, actually, but not because of the Germanic invasions, but simply because when the Roman army withdrew from the island, Britain was left to this provisional government of Romano-Britons that were these, Celto-Roman, elites that technically were living as Romans, with the large estates and so on. We don't know what actually happens, but we know that in a very few time, all the land boundary, the land plots were dramatically redrawn, resized, as far as we understand, was a revolution, and a pretty ugly one. We're talking about the entire society devastated by this, right? It's in this context that the Anglo-Saxons also started arriving and creating all these various small kingdoms that will cause this other dynamics, such as, for example, the withdrawal of some Brittonic populations in Wales. In fact, the term Welsh was used to indicate the non-Germans, and this is something we find, I don't know, in Wallonia, for example, in Wallachia, the Swiss Val, all these boundary areas for which in Germanic, the non-Germanic speaking in a way were called the foreigners, right? So not the Romans, right? Meaning we are the Germans, but those guys that we don't understand what they actually say. And that's just for the record of the history of Wales, that had, as you know, also as Ireland, important connections with the Iberian Peninsula since, very long time. Some of these guys actually fled to Armorica, to today's Bretagne, famously enough. So there is a kind of a Celtic coming back, even in part to these areas, from which originally, from the Roman conquest, some guys had fled before. I mean, it's fascinating, and there are lots of myths and legends. Think about just Arthur. They're all mixed also with the legacy of the Roman presence there, the various units that show, that betray also this change in the military culture of Rome itself. But we will talk about that more specifically on another occasion. The Rhine border was crossed. This was the major wave, the thing that really, overturned the situation in the West in many ways. In the winter 406-407, by different groups that are normally summarized as Alans, Burgundians, Swabians, and Vandals, right? That in fact swarmed in Roman Gaul, finding the only opposition of the Frankish Federati, right? The Franks at this point were already, settled across, the northwestern Germany and these areas of Belgian Gaul fundamentally. And at the beginning, they tried to actually Franks were crushed at the first attempt to stop these guys, so they basically let them in. It's just that these guys decided not to attack the Franks, because after all, they lived in the least Romanized areas. There was plenty of much wealthier and fertile land in the south. So as you know, they began ravaging Gaul, Spain, and so on. And especially the crossing of the Pyrenees and the invasion of the Iberian Peninsula brought to this collapse of Roman control, right? Spain was also in demographic crisis, wasn't garrisoned anymore properly by the Roman Empire. So what happened is that between 415 and 418, the Roman Empire even allowed the Goths to enter there on their behalf. And this allowed actually the Alans to be dispersed and to actually push the Vandals to the extreme south of Spain, that allegedly, but it's not certain actually, would take the name of Andalusia from Vandalusia, so from the land of the Vandals, right? But actually, the Vandals had other plans. They made a mess actually in Spain. They actually split even in two parts. One was wiped out. The other proceeded to Africa, where they would find more successful government. We made a video on the Vandals, that every once in a while make this videos monothematically centered one of the Germanic populations. That on the Vandals and on the Burgundians are very old and they suck badly. So I won't tell you now to watch them, but I may remake them. Say so there are a bit more the history and depth of them. Under Valentinian III, that ruled for these 30 years between 425-55, the empire knew actually how to react to this situation, right? Through military actions that actually revealed the weakness of this barbarian systems, right? It's not that these guys arrived and began to settle and building solid kingdoms, effective military realities. No, it took actually a lot of work and sometimes very drastic changes, as would happen especially under the Merovingians, that literally caused a shock within the same Frankish world with their rise. Especially, the military intervention of the Romans was quite firm. Aetius, this general, that famously had a decisive role in the guide of an army that was surely Romano-Germanic at this point, right? It was full of Germans and of other barbarians alongside the Roman army. The Roman army survived in this sense. I always try to distinguish the fact that when we speak of Roman army, we tend to say, you see, this is the moment in which the Roman army became Germanized, because they were all Germans. This is not really correct. You see, as long as the Roman army was the Roman army, they were just Romans by law, right? And these were also, of course, of German ancestry. Of course they were, but they were still Romans, and they were deeply Romanized and concretely reasoning and acting and fighting and being Roman by esprit de corps and institutionally and so on. That was the Roman military, controlled by the Roman state. When you say they were Germanized, now we don't have time to digress on the mistake that we make when we think even about the change of the equipment. We made a video about the late Roman infantry in this regard, in terms of Rome wasn't like the first days. These guys didn't wear the typical armor the first century. That's a whole load of garbage, right? It has no sense by the slightest military logic. On the contrary, what people refer to most often is to the Federati. That in this sense were not Romans, right? Were not considered Roman army. They were properly another people, right? An allied people that fought alongside the Romans. And this wasn't even a new practice, right? Because since the beginning, since the Republic, the Roman army has been always consisted of as many foreigners as many Roman citizens, right? There's never been a moment in the Roman army, actually, in which the Roman citizenry was prevalent in this regard. It was normal. Think about the Italic Soci or all the others. Those weren't Romans, right? It had always been like that. So it's not even something new, right? And here the Germans, even more specifically, are something else. They're another thing. They're not part of the Roman army. So what is way more correct to say is that as long as the Roman state exists, right, it can be supported demographically, agriculturally, it works like with its own bureaucracy, administration, and so on, you have a Roman army. Where this shrinks, the Roman army shrinks, and these other guys take over, but there is no Germanization of the Roman army. As long as the Roman army exists, it is exclusively Roman, because there is nothing else that can define a Roman army, right? And the cultural influences, given that the Romans had dramatically influenced the Germanic military culture as well, are practically senseless in this regard. But in this time, as we've seen, Aetius manages also to contain the Visigothic pressure in the south, the one of the Franks on the Rhine. He, as we've seen before, defeated and settled the Burgundians in Sapaudia, right? And especially in alliance with the Franks and Visigoths, here you see what it means, Roman army plus allies, repelled the invasion of the Huns guided by Attila, who were defeated in Gaul in 451, and that retreated from Italy eventually also in 452, also thanks to the plague, the papal mediation, and especially also the Eastern Roman army was harassing their lines of communications with their central, their stronghold in the Pannonian plain. Just to say also how the West and East were cooperating, however, in this regard, if they didn't have anything, impellent that they had to throw at one another. On the motives of the collapse of the Hunnic Empire here, we don't speak. We'll have to do it another time. However, what is important is that Etzius is killed by the emperor in 454 by this palace conspiracy, and the emperor actually would be killed in the same way the year after. Probably an overlooked agent in here was the Vandalic Kingdom, as we were saying before, because in the Mediterranean, the Vandals, as we've seen, had arrived into Africa in 429. Africa meaning Tunisia, basically in eastern Algeria today. That's Roman Africa when you hear about it. And the empire didn't quite manage to cope with them, right? In terms, they didn't probably make them as federati as the others. And there is the guide of Gaiseric, right? That ruled for this astonishingly long time, right? Gaiseric is one of the single most important leaders of the Germanic peoples that existed at this time. You can easily quote Clovis, Theodoric, perhaps Alaric in this sense, but Gaiseric was, if anything, the most direct responsible of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, indirectly, right? And it will tell you why now. He ruled from 428-477. The Vandals had occupied Carthage, that was their capital. In this sense, they in 439, and here they basically built a maritime power with a continuous action of piracy in the Mediterranean and the invasion of its islands. Sicily in 440, the Balearic Islands, Corsica and Sardinia in 455, and also famously, always via sea, sacked Rome in 455. The main problem with this, it's not much the fact that they inflicted these territorial losses, especially the ones of the islands, but the fact that they kept controlling Tunisia, right? Tunisia was the granary of Rome at the time. Sicily and Sardinia had produced important amounts of grain, historically speaking, but Africa could not compare. It was like Egypt for Constantinople, right? If you want to keep fed the mob, the army in Italy, you have to control Tunisia. The same goes with Egypt in Constantinople. That's why after the Islamic invasions, the Constantinople will shift to the Black Sea, to the Ukrainian reign. So what happens is that, famously enough, now we have to skip a lot of aspects, but Majorianus, considered as the last effective ruler of the Western Roman Empire, launched this massive reconquest that actually succeeded in Spain. They managed to defeat the Visigoths, and it ultimately was shipwrecked, let's say, literally, by the Vandal intervention. Because if the Romans had seized Spain, Africa would have been next. So at that point also, the Eastern Roman fleet sent this massive expedition against Africa, and Gaiseric didn't give up. Any other king at that point would have simply done like the Visigoths, say, okay, we surrender, we came back being federati, and obeying would send us whichever frontier you like. These guys resist. They managed to destroy this enormous Roman fleet, and at that point there is no way to recover Africa anymore. So Italy, after Majorianus' expedition, it was clear to everybody, had exhausted its fighting and labor force. Like there were no troops to send anymore out there. So the reconquest of the West at that point becomes, it ends. That's properly the moment. We're talking about the 60s of the 5th century. Majorianus proved that by the 60s of the 5th century, Rome could still reinvade Italy, could say altogether, reinvade Spain, right, and technically threaten with the Eastern Roman Empire, also Africa, and reconnecting this broader Mediterranean dimension, Western Mediterranean dimension, was actually the most advanced, the most populated, the ones that worked the most. Northern Gaul had been fundamentally, more easily Germanized by the Franks, as we'll see in a while. So this was the turning point, and without Gaiseric, this would have not happened. So Gaiseric is properly, if you want to credit someone for the end of the Roman Empire, look at him, because he didn't do it on purpose, but he caused it anyway. I mean, of course he did it on purpose, but what was the chance? They had to abandon Africa to destroy his own country. Of course not. This is, if you really want to spot it, the broader turning point, at least in the strategic balance of the Western sector. And one could go on stating that eastern half, eventually under Belisarius, under Justinian, his general Belisarius reconquered all the Western Mediterranean again, and that if it hadn't been mostly for the plague that spread there, probably they would have maintained it, right? So when the migration seemed to be finally over, there were new contrasts at the vertex of the Western Roman Empire, which was this unfortunate series of really powerless rulers that were set on the throne by now the Germanic army of Italy, that was not even properly made by a single people. They were just all the remnants of the various war bands coming from everywhere that had previously made up now the last troops of in service of the state. So there was just a very limited control to Italy and a part of Gaul, especially Burgundia, that this time was still kind of kept under the Romans after all. So that tells you how much the Burgundians had been crippled by the time. And however, they still played something, especially after the at the time of Odoacer, whatever. At this point was a Roman general of barbarian origin, Syagrius, that held from 464 to 486 a personal domain between the Loire and the Seine rivers. Very fertile areas, after all, for Northern Gallic standards. The most important centers, which also the future Frankish Neustria would be, was basically the last Gallo-Roman avampost in a somewhat Germanized context. Because objectively in the south of the Loire, there were the Visigoths, right? In the southeast there were the Alemanni, in the northeast there were the Franks. So Germanized in this sense. And it would be eventually crushed by Clovis, famously enough. Now we also stopped because, aside from the fact that we made tons of videos in this phase, but we can't state everything now because it steps into now more an early medieval dimension, ideally speaking. But in 476, famously, the Shirus general Odoacer deposed the young Romulus Augustus, known Augustulus, so in a diminutive sense, and sent back the Western imperial insignia to Constantinople, getting in exchange this personal dominion that, however, was not fully recognized by the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno, right? As a specific, he got the title of Rex Italia, if I'm not wrong, but title of patrician, but it wasn't. It was more the Rex in Italia, something like you are at the head just of the troops, as he had been, right, and not properly a ruler of Italy specifically meant. It was still within the Roman controlled in this regard. Zeno instead famously sent the Ostrogoths, now that had popped out after the disgregation of the Hunnic Empire in Illyricum, that were another problem, just like the Visigoths had been before, sent to Italy to crush. Actually, Odoacer was defeated and killed in 493. So Theodoric would give life to this reign that would have governed over the Italian peninsula over 553, and that we have also discussed recently in that video about the I remember what's the title, but it's like from the Roman to the Germanic military organization, something like that, in which we take into consideration specifically the Ostrogoths. We made in this context, in of continuity with the Roman thing, which in Italy was extremely high because the Roman state was still intact here, right? It's not that by 476 Roman Italy was there, was functioning completely, right? It was just limited to the peninsula and a few other areas, but it was there. It was still even faring fairly well, actually. So the point overall is to evaluate the importance of the graduality of this process, of the continuity of the Roman control on all of these lands, because the Romans, by the way, would always claim these lands back. The constant connection that would happen also afterwards with all these powers and Constantinople, because nobody ever thought for an instant here that the Roman Empire was over. It was just next door. It was where it had always been, right? And eventually we will see maybe a bit better this moment of connection. We made a lot of videos, actually, especially to explain the balance that was formed between the Catholic bloc represented by the Franks and the Byzantines versus the Arian bloc represented by the Goths and actually the pagan supporters of Central Europe. That is one of the single most important and overlooked topics of early medieval history, and that I hope we will come back discussing soon again. For now, however, we'll stop it here. I hope this was kind of useful. It gave other food for thought, and for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time. See you next time.